On December 18th, 1994, Alison Botha came back to her South African home after a night with friends. As soon as she turned off her engine, a man entered her car. Paralyzed with fear, his words echoed in her head, "Move over or I'll kill you." With the steel blade he had pointed at her, she didn't dare disobey. And so, Alison shifted her body into the passenger seat, contemplating jumping out of the car as he drove off. The man would reassure Alison that he wasn't going to hurt her. He merely needed to use her car for an hour to find his friend who stole his TV. These words gave her some form of relief. Extra relief would come when she spotted a police cruiser. However, that extra relief would vanish when the cruiser drove off into the night. Eventually, the man, who identified himself as Clinton, would head into the dark city streets. There, he would stop the vehicle and allow a second man to get in. The second man, calling himself Thenus, would give her a cigarette to calm her nerves. After this, the three would travel out of the city and onto a road surrounded by darkness. They would head to an isolated area filled with broken glass, beer bottles, and litter. Eventually, Clinton would turn, look her in the eyes, and inform her that they both wanted intercourse. With the car intentionally hidden from any nearby vehicles, there was nothing she could do to stop them. Thenus would exit the car, stroll off, and then smoke a cigarette under the moonlight. Clinton would then order Alison to remove her clothing, which she did. With his knife aimed at her head, he violated her in the back seat of her car. After he was done, he would call out to Thenus, who would then take over. Alison would etch their faces into her memory. Every little detail about them she would carve into her mind. Once Thenus was done, he would mistakenly call Clinton by his real name, which was Frans. Alison would then redress herself. Frans then turned to Alison stating, "If we take you into town now, you are going to go to the police." Alison would promise that she would not, in fear of her parents finding out. However, the two men would once again force her to undress. This time, they would take her jewelry for themselves. Alison, at this point, was convinced that she would be let go. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Frans got on top of her, wrapping his hands around her neck. He squeezed tighter until she could no longer breathe. Frans's face nearly touched hers, his cold, remorseless eyes staring directly into hers. She managed to let the words, "Please don't kill me," escape from her mouth. Despite this, Frans continued squeezing his hands tighter around her throat. Eventually, the sight would fade from Alison's eyes and he would release his grip. Moments later, she would regain consciousness and see one of the men kneeling over her. With the moon glowing behind his head, he moved his arm back and forth. In Alison's dazed state of mind, she couldn't take in what was happening. The man was slashing her throat. Alison could hear the sound of her flesh tearing. Her attacker continued slicing through her neck, leaving blood flowing onto the sand. Eventually, they would stop and leave her there to die. Alison rolled onto her stomach, fearing the men would come back. Luckily, they did not. She crawled forward, hearing a sound in the distance. To her horror, she would soon realize the sound was actually coming from the gaping wound in her neck. At this point, she used her hand to cover the gash. However, it was so deep that her entire hand slipped into the inside of her throat. Unfortunately, the terror wasn't over. Both of the men returned. They rummaged through her car before starting the engine and speeding off into the night. Alison lay dying, surrounded by trash and filth. She used her finger to write the name Thenus as well as the words "I love mom" in the sand. Alison would then have an out-of-body experience. This would be described as a fantastic lightness that lifted her soul from her damaged body. She floated approximately 3 meters above the ground, looking down at her physical form. And with that, she found herself with a choice: either accept her own death or go back and fight for life. Despite heading off into everlasting peace and tranquility, Alison decided to go back to her body. There she was met with searing pain beyond what she ever thought possible. Her eyes locked on the headlights of a car passing on the nearby road. Once she fully gained consciousness, she pushed herself up to her knees. Her hand brushed against her stomach where she felt something wet, warm, and slimy. Once again, she would face true horror. Alison looked down only to witness approximately 20 feet of her intestines spilling out of her abdomen. Her attempt to scoop them back into her gut would fail. Unfortunately, her intestines would slither out of her hands and continue swinging back and forth in front of her very eyes. After they had strangled her, they had also stabbed her repeatedly in the stomach. She would attempt to force them back inside her gut a second time. Again, she would fail. There was simply too much spilling out of her wounds. Moments later, she would come across a shirt on the sand. And with this, Alison would scoop up her innards, using the moonlight to guide her path. Broken glass cut through her hands as she crawled forward. Eventually, her body became numb, exhausted from the trauma and exertion. She collapsed, ready to die. However, the thought of her mother entered her mind. This gave her the strength to fight through the exhaustion, hoisting herself up on her feet. At this point, there was an issue. She couldn't see. However, she would soon realize that her eyes were fine. It was her neck that was the problem. The wound in her throat had been cut so deep that her head flopped backwards, resting on her shoulder blades. Unfortunately, this meant that the blood supply to her brain was being cut off. With one hand holding up her intestines, she used the other to force her head in position. Once it was, she moved her hand back to her neck to stop the gurgling sound and blood. Again, her hand slipped deep into her throat. While walking, she would collapse to the ground several times but find the strength to get back on her feet. Alison would also repeatedly lose consciousness during this time. Miraculously, she would make it to the street. After this, she would make her way to the middle of the road in order to be seen by someone. However, she would collapse again, her head slamming down to the concrete. With her back to the ground, her head rolled at such an odd angle that her eyes met the road. Finally, she heard the sound of an oncoming engine. The car eventually stopped in front of her as she frantically waved her arms for help. Unfortunately, no one would exit the vehicle. With her blood and intestines glistening in the headlights of the car, the driver would slowly make their way around her body. Seconds later, they would speed off into the night, leaving her in the darkness. Understandably, the driver must have been terrified to see such a sight. Moments later, another car would stop. This time, the occupants would get out, only to find Alison's naked body bleeding profusely. Upon further observation, they would discover the horribly deep slash in her neck. Her veins, muscles, and windpipe could be seen by the naked eye. One of the witnesses, named Tien, took Alison's pulse, which was found to be faint. She had lost an insane amount of blood, and even more was pouring out onto the road by the second. Alison would point to the shirt on her stomach, which Tien would then remove. Tien would be horrified by the sight of Alison's exposed intestines, which was now covered in dirt, leaves, and twigs. It would take 2 hours for an ambulance to arrive. When she arrived to the hospital, she was described as resembling a corpse. Along with this, her spinal column was visible through her neck injury. According to her doctors, a small nick in the thyroid can result in death. Alison's thyroid had been sliced in 2. The muscles in her neck had also retracted back into the base of her skull. Over the next few hours, doctors would stitch her throat from the inside out. Her intestines would also be cleaned and placed back into her abdomen. Despite having gone through hell and back, only a few days later she would find the strength to identify her attackers to police. Later on, they'd be caught, confess to the crimes, and be arrested. Frans and Thenus would admit during trial that the morning following the attempted murder, they would make breakfast with the same knife they used to slice open Alison's neck. During that time, the blade was still covered in Alison's dried blood. It would also become clear that had Alison not survived, many more victims would have most likely died. In the end, both men would be sentenced to life in prison for their attempted murder. Alison would go on to make a full recovery and even write a book about the experience titled I Have Life.